Michael was like any other boy of 7 years old, a bit more mature, but his dreams for a future consisted of seeing a real-life dinosaur, riding an elephant at the local zoo, or trying to wind down after an exciting day, even though he didn't want it to end. His parents loved him and his sister more than anything in the world, and as annoying as he was to his teenage sister, she was very patient with him. His family didn't come from money, and oftentimes his parents worked so hard that they were too tired to spend more than maybe an hour with him in the evenings. But this night had been special. It had been his first birthday in their new home. New. Well, new to Michael and his family. But this was his birthday, and it was a special occasion. His family had gone all out that day to make sure Michael knew he was the center of their world. It wasn't about the presents. It was about those special moments with his parents and sister that really meant something to him. These moments were becoming fewer and farther between. The excitement was barely beginning to wear off as he lay in bed, eyes wide open. His sandy blonde hair was still damp from his bath just prior, and he felt the cool touch of his pillowcase as it absorbed the moisture from his hair. It was a good day. He listened as his sister told their parents good night in the hallway. He swore her voice sounded like that of an angel, echoing off the hardwood floors and plaster walls. He heard her bedroom door shut and saw the light from the hallway fall into darkness from the gap below his door. Then his parents' door shut just up the stairs, and all went silent. He wished there were more days like this, not birthdays, just days, family days. Still, he couldn't help but lay there with a large grin as his eyes began getting heavy. The soft, warm glow of his nightlight keeping whatever small fear he had of the dark at bay. His mind shifted between the amazing day he had, recalling hearing the happiness scattered throughout the home, to a soft murmur of sleep. The memories indistinguishable from dreams. Michael's eyes opened as he felt the pressure building in his bladder. He never got in trouble if he had an accident in bed, but he was getting better at controlling it. With his eyes barely open and hazy, Michael reluctantly crawled out of bed and slowly opened his door to make the journey to the restroom down the hall. When he was finished, he turned out the bathroom light and headed back down the hall to his room at the bottom of the stairs. But just before he could slip into his room, he heard the old wood floor creak at the top of the stairs. With his eyes still burning from not quite being awake, he peered at the steps, afraid he had awakened his parents. He turned quickly and hurried into his room, being careful not to let the door squeak as he began to close it when he heard the faint sound of what sounded like a ball slowly bouncing down the stairs. His fuzzy mind wandered. Had he left his toys out, and this was a subtle way for his parents to let him know? If so, how did the ball even get upstairs? Michael peered out of his room at the bottom of the stairs and watched as his yellow and black striped ball came to a stop against the wall. He walked over to the wall to retrieve it and began to apologize for leaving it out when he glanced up the stairs and saw not either of his parents, but a boy roughly his own age, standing, staring down at him. Fear gripped Michael as he gripped the ball and turned away to start back to his room when a faint voice fell down the stairs as if there was a physical weight to it. "Michael, come play with me." Michael quickly closed his door louder than he normally would, but silently hoping it would wake someone, anyone. He jumped into his bed and pulled the covers over his head, shaking. This wasn't the first time Michael had been afraid in his own home, but lately it's been getting worse. This was the first time he saw the boy. Now, somehow, Michael felt sad for the child. He listened as the door to his parents' room slowly opened. Then footsteps on the stairs followed. Michael peered out from under his blanket to see the knob on his door turn. Then the door slowly swung open. The silhouette of his father stood in the doorway with the light of the hallway behind him. "Michael, are you okay? Another accident?" Michael pulled the blanket down just far enough to look out, still shaken with fear and a little regret. "No, no accident. Oh boy, the stairs." He could barely get the words out. His father, still half asleep himself, rubbed Michael's head gently and laid next to him. "It's okay, buddy. I'm sure it was just a bad dream." Michael knew this wasn't a dream. Or was it? With the calming touch of his father's hand, Michael drifted back to sleep. The next morning, Michael awoke to the sun shining in his window and the sounds of his parents hurrying to get ready for work. You know, the busy sounds of morning just before the old house would fall silent and he and his sister would be left home alone. Michael hurried out of bed to catch a glimpse of them, still afraid. He avoided eye contact with the stairs as he rushed past them, but daylight made it better. Michael reached the living room, still in his pajamas. "Good morning, sleepyhead," calmly lamented his mother. She was hurrying to get ready for work, but wanted to make sure to acknowledge her son. "Be sure to be good for Anya while we are at work. She isn't feeling the best and could probably use your help today." Anya, his sister, who was likely still in bed. "Okay, Mom." There were days lately where Anya had not been in the best of health. Not sickly, just tired. A lot. But she usually got over it around midday. "Don't let this old house scare you, buddy. It makes noises, but it's a good house." There was a little doubt in her own voice that a 7-year-old wouldn't pick up on. All the same, Michael didn't reply with more than a smile. Michael watched as his parents walked out the front door and heard them lock it behind them. As he walked to the refrigerator, he noted the phone numbers on the door as he opened it. Michael had tried memorizing them. Throughout the weeks since his parents took new jobs down the road from each other, Michael was insistent on asking them what each number was for and what the words said, until he could remember them all without looking, as he wasn't quite able to read all the letters. Michael grabbed his Lunchable out of the refrigerator and sat it on the table, pulling out a chair to enjoy it. Just as Michael sat to eat his bologna and cheese Lunchable, the phone on the counter rang. The telephone was an old stock phone from the phone company, an ugly yellow with a rotary dial. Michael, startled, jumped down from his kitchen chair. In doing so, he knocked his snack into the floor. Annoyed, he ignored the mess and rushed to the phone. Maybe it was his grandmother checking up on him, which she often did. He picked up the heavy receiver and placed it to his ear. Before he could greet the other person, "Michael?" a faint, static-filled child's voice questioned. "Yeah?" The line crackled with static for a moment. "Will you play with me today?" Michael felt his heart pick up speed, but it wasn't unheard of for one of his friends to have their parents call for him. "I'm not allowed outside today." The phone crackled again against Michael's ear. "You don't have to leave the house." Michael pulled the phone away from his ear just in time to hear his sister calling down the stairs for him. "Michael! Michael! Come up here, please." Michael put the phone back to his ear. "I have to go. My sister needs me." Then quickly hung up the phone. But instead of fear, Michael felt sorrow. He would like to have someone to play with, and the other boys sounded lonely as well. Michael hesitated to climb the stairs to the upper bedroom, still feeling uncomfortable from the night prior. Maybe his father was right. Maybe it was just a dream. He realized he had climbed these stairs 100 times in the last few months, and nothing ever happened. So he bound up them as quickly as he could, then rushed down the hall to his sister's door. Again, his name came faintly from behind the door. "Michael." He opened the door and saw that Anya was still sleeping. Figuring she must have been talking in her sleep, Michael slowly backed out of the door and tried his best to close it without making a sound. but it creaked slowly. Anya awoke with a startle. "Michael, what are you doing?" Confused, Michael replied, "Just came up to see what you wanted." Also a bit confused and slightly annoyed, Anya replied, "Nothing, I was sleeping." Michael stepped back into the room. "You yelled for me." Anya forced her eyes fully open with a haze over her vision. "No, I didn't. Are Mom and Dad gone?" Michael just nodded. "Okay, I'm getting up. Are you hungry?" Hungry. He had forgotten about the mess he made in the kitchen and rushed back down the stairs to clean it up before his sister could reprimand him for it. When Michael bolted down the stairs, skipping a step every few leaps and holding the handrail, something caught his attention at the bottom of the stairs. His ball. Michael skidded to a halt halfway down the stairs, gripping the handrail as he almost lost his balance. He was sure he took the ball into his room the night before, and it wasn't at the bottom of the stairs when he went up to his sister's room. He slowly inched his way down the stairs and noticed the ball moving slightly. Then a creak in the hallway from where he just came from. "Michael, what are you doing making so much noise?" It was Anya. "Anya, my ball." "Yeah, I see it. Better get it up before Mom and Dad get home. We wouldn't want them to trip over it and get hurt." The old wood floor in the upstairs hallway creaked under the weight of Anya's steps as she disappeared into the bathroom. Michael continued his slow descent down the stairs until he reached his ball. He snatched it up quickly and threw it into his room as he hurried past it. Finally, Michael reached the kitchen in time to hear the upstairs toilet flush and the sink turn on. This old house echoed every sound. He hurried to clean up the spilled food. He listened as the door to Anya's room swung open, then closed again. Relieved he had got the mess cleaned up in time, he would now have to rely on his sister to make him something for lunch. As he turned the kitchen corner to enter the hallway, the phone rang again. This time, slightly aggravated, Michael picked up the heavy receiver to the ugly yellow rotary phone. "Michael?" It was the boy's voice again. "Yeah? Who are you?" The phone crackled for a moment. "It's Rory. Will you play with me?" Michael, ever the blunt personality. "I'm not supposed to talk to strangers, and I already told you I can't play outside today." The phone sizzled with electric static. "I'm your friend. You don't have to go outside." Michael, not remembering anyone named Rory, much less a friend by that name. "I'll have to ask my sister. Call me later." Then promptly hung up the phone just as Anya entered the kitchen. "Who are you talking to?" Not wanting to try to explain the call and feeling really hungry. "A friend. Can you make me something to eat?" Anya was not a good cook. In fact, she avoided cooking whenever possible unless it was to heat up water for macaroni and cheese or some microwave tater tots. So that's what she did. The two of them sat down to eat together. Anya still looked like she wasn't feeling well, but she tried to stay lighthearted in her quick meal with her little brother. When he asked what was wrong with her, she just responded that she wasn't quite sure and just felt weak and tired. Being a good little brother, Michael offered to take care of her if she wanted to lay down on the couch. Anya smiled and reluctantly agreed. In his eyes, Anya was a princess, and Michael would do anything in his limited abilities to help her. When they finished eating, Anya crossed over into the living room and laid on the couch as Michael turned on the floor model console television for her and covered her with an Afghan that their grandmother had made for them. The TV blared. Like sands in the hourglass, so are the days of our lives. These soap operas were not Michael's favorite, so he headed to his room. "Yell for me if you need anything, Anya." She smiled and nodded. As Michael rounded the corner to the hallway, he stopped suddenly. There, at the bottom of the stairs, sat his ball. It was still daylight, so fear wasn't the first reaction Michael had. Annoyance. He knew he put his ball back in his room for a second time, so he crept over to it and picked it up. Just then, a voice from the top of the stairs. "Michael, will you play with me now?" He looked up to see the boy from the night before. It hadn't been a dream. Michael took a step back. How did you get in here? The boy slowly began descending the stairs, almost as if his feet weren't touching the wood, but it squeaked regardless. I've always been here. My parents left me here. Michael may have been mature for a 7-year-old, but this didn't strike him as odd in his child's mind. Sure, a boy living in his house was weird, but Michael was getting bored with sitting in his room day after day, alone in the summer, and someone to play with would be something different, welcomed. Michael inched backwards towards his room, the boy growing closer. I'm scared, Michael. I'm all alone and have no one to play with. Michael, feeling oddly calm, gestured to his room. Okay, but we can't wake my sister. We have to be quiet. The boy smiled and followed Michael to his room. Michael slowly closed his door as his new friend sat in the floor, holding the ball. My name is Rory. The boy was a reverse of Michael's own appearance in almost every way. Michael had sandy blonde hair. Rory had dark hair, so dark he couldn't make out the individual hairs. Michael was olive-skinned. Rory was unnaturally pale. Michael sat on the floor across from Rory as Rory rolled the ball to him. Michael rolled it back. The two laughed and rolled the ball back and forth. Michael was just happy not to have to sit in his room alone again. A knock at the door shook Michael from his happy trance. Michael, and the door opened. Who are you talking to? Anya seemed hazy still. Rory, he's my new friend. Anya looked around but only saw Michael. Where is Rory? I'd like to meet your new friend. Michael looked around the room. He's hiding behind the curtain. He's really shy. A chill creeped into Anya's spine as she looked at the curtain to see it bulging slightly. Slowly, Anya walked to the window and pulled the curtain back to find it empty. Michael, this isn't funny. If you want to have an imaginary friend, that's up to you. But don't scare me like this. Michael with a smile. Okay, sis. I'm sorry. Anya closed the door and retreated back up the stairs to her room. A couple weeks went by, and Michael continued playing with Rory in his room, silently, discreetly. Sometimes Rory would appear in the middle of the night, but Michael would tell him he was too tired to play, and Rory would go back up the stairs. One morning, everything was routine. Michael awoke to the summer sun blaring in his window, to hear the rustling of his parents hurriedly readying for work. As usual, he went out to tell them goodbye, and he would see them later. His parents knew of his imaginary friend and would play along with it. Michael seemed happier in the old house now. Michael watched them leave and hurried back to his room where Rory waited with the ball. That day they talked about all kinds of stuff, innocent child stuff, favorite foods, favorite games, fears. Rory explained that his biggest fear was being alone. Michael talked about being afraid of swimming in the ocean, and among other childlike fears. All normal conversations for kids. They played and laughed. Anya would peek in once in a while to check on Michael and go back to her room unconcerned. A couple hours passed, and there was a knock at the front door. Michael scrambled up the stairs and pounded on Anya's door. Someone's at the front door. Anya called back, Well, see who it is. Quickly, Michael replied, I'm not allowed to open the door. He could hear Anya sigh. Okay, I'm coming. When Anya opened the door to see her grandmother standing there, it wasn't a big surprise. She would often stop by to check on them or drop some food off for the siblings. But this time was different. Anya could see her grandmother had been crying, even though she tried not to show it. Her salt and pepper hair was pulled back tight in a bun that revealed her crow's feet around her eyes, but there was some smudged mascara lingering under her eyes. with faint black streaks leading down her cheeks. "Grandma, what's wrong?" As Michael peered from behind his sister, their grandmother took in a deep breath. "Michael, can you go to your room for a minute? I need to talk to Anya." Michael's mind raced. What had Anya done wrong? She was a good girl and never got into any trouble. Michael retreated to his room slowly, hoping they would start talking before he reached his door, but it was only met with silence. Michael entered his room to see Rory sitting on the floor looking sad. "You're going away, Michael." Michael gestured for Rory to be quiet. Rory continued his sad expression. "Don't worry, Michael. I'll come with you." Michael could hear his sister and grandmother's faint voices, but couldn't make out what they were saying, only that they were both crying. Michael was small, but he felt protective of his sister. He poked his head out from his door slowly and tried to listen, but they were silent. Michael stepped into the hallway and slowly walked to the kitchen to see Anya crying and his grandmother standing behind her, rubbing Anya's back gently. Her Lee press-on nails lightly snagging Anya's shirt. Both women noticed Michael at the same time, and Anya motioned for the young man to come to her. Slowly, Michael felt dread as he shuffled his feet across the kitchen floor. When he was close enough, Anya grabbed Michael and pulled him onto her lap and wrapped her arms around him and began crying again. "What's going on? What happened?" Michael questioned with a heavy heart. His grandmother's eyes teared up again. "There's been a terrible accident. You're going to come to live with me." Michael welled up with tears and more questions. "What accident? I don't want to leave. Mom and Dad will miss us when they come home." Anya hugged Michael tighter as his grandmother fought back tears. "Your parents won't be coming home, Michael. I'm so sorry." Michael pried himself from Anya's grip. "I'm not leaving. Mom and Dad will be home. You'll see." Anya reached for Michael as he ran away, but the grandmother pulled her hand on Anya's arm. "Let him go. It's going to take us all some time." Anya slunk her head onto the table. Michael made it to his room and slammed the door closed behind him to see Rory standing in the middle of the room. "See? You're going away." Michael, angry at this point. "I'm not going anywhere. Leave me alone. Go away." Rory turned away and headed for the door with a sadistic grin behind Michael's back. No sooner than Rory left the room, Anya entered. "Is your little friend here?" Michael, with tears in his eyes and an angry expression, just shook his head vigorously. Anya closed the door behind her softly. "Michael, sit down, please." He could tell she was going to start crying at any moment. Michael took a seat on the bed and Anya sat next to him, Michael's legs shaking. She was trying hard not to wrap her arms around him and burst into tears again, but she fought it back to stay strong for her little brother. "Grandma is going to stay with us for a few days. Then we'll be going to stay with her. I'm so sorry, little man. You should come out and say something. Grandma's hurting too." Michael just stared blankly at the wall, still angry. Minutes passed. "I want to talk to them. When are they coming home?" Anya took a deep breath. She didn't know the details, but even if she did, she couldn't tell him. Not now. Not like this. "They won't be coming home. This isn't their fault. They didn't choose this. I know you're angry and hurt. We both are. But we will have to get through this the best we can." She didn't really believe the words flowing from her, but her brother's sake, it needed to be said. He was still too young to fully understand. Prior to knocking on the door of her son to break the news to Anya and Michael, Edith had been called to identify the bodies of her son and his wife. This was the hardest thing she would ever have done. She had been living alone since her husband passed away 2 years prior, but this wasn't the way she wanted to fill the void. The reports claimed that her son and daughter-in-law were traveling through an intersection when a man failed to see the red light and smashed into the side of their car. The occupants of both vehicles died instantly. Time seemed to stand still for Michael and Anya as they adjusted into their new home at their grandmother's. But time did pass all the same. The tragedy scarred them both, as one would expect. Although it never healed, it did get easier. Days turned into weeks, turned into years. Anya had graduated law school and was now in a small firm in the town they were raised. She never wanted to leave where her parents lay to rest, and the thought of abandoning Michael was even further out of the question. And although Michael had taken over the house his grandmother had left him in her will, he still seemed troubled and unable to get his life together. He had gotten his bachelor's degree in accounting, but could never hold a job for more than a couple of years. Neither had ever married nor had any children. They didn't want to put kids through what they had gone through potentially. But even though Michael seemed financially unstable, there was one constant in his life: Rory. Rory had followed Michael to his grandmother's after the death of his parents. After their deaths, Michael kept Rory a secret, per Rory's request. But after the accident, things changed. Michael became bitter towards Rory, and Rory, he began showing signs of being less than a best friend. The two grew up alongside one another, but a day came when Rory stopped coming around. Michael had blamed Rory for the accident, an accusation that never went contested. Rory would just chuckle when confronted with it, then disappear into the shadows, only to reappear days later to push Michael to his limits. When Michael would threaten to tell his sister about him, Rory would remind him of the accident. But eventually, Rory went away, at least for a time. Michael's life finally began to turn around. At 30 years old, Michael had landed a job at a local tax firm that paid rather well. He enjoyed his job and the people he worked with. If only his parents were watching to see how neither he nor his sister would have to work tirelessly in dead-end jobs just to make ends meet. But the thought of selling the house he had been raised in since he was 7 never crossed his mind. It was his last bit of physical evidence that his parents even existed. Once in a while, he would drive by the old house. The newest owners had updated it and restored it back to its Victorian heritage. But he remembered exactly where each room was. Driving by the old house was becoming fewer and farther between. One night, after having a drink with some colleagues, Michael returned home to find a note on the counter from Anya. "Hey, call me. I miss you." He poured himself a bourbon on the rocks and pulled out his phone. He didn't even hear the other end of the phone ring before his sister answered. "Hey, little brother." He chuckled. "Hey, sis." The two talked for an hour, catching up to each other's busy lives, but the conversation ended on a sour note. "I told you, I'm not selling Grandma's house." "It isn't her house anymore. It's yours. She would want you to move on. Call me when you have something else to talk about." And he hung up abruptly. Michael finished his bourbon, which suddenly tasted rotten, and dimmed the lights. He sat in the low, warm light and just remembered everything. His parents, his sister taking care of him while they were at work. Some of it was a haze, being he was only 7 at that time, and he was forgetting the sound of his parents' voices. Even his grandmother's voice was beginning to fade. He remembered the old house, the floors that needed refinished, the plaster walls, his room, then Rory, the ball. And just then Michael felt something tap his foot. He looked down. It was the ball. The same ball from his childhood. He kicked it away just as the childish voice spoke. "Will you play with me?" Michael's hair on his arm stood on end as if electricity had poured through his body. Then from the shadowed corner of the living room, Rory emerged slowly. his haggard face concealed by blackness, his tattered clothes that moved in a way that both defied logic and seemed to have a sentience of their own. Michael sat up abruptly, and every bit of the alcohol he had consumed that night seemed to dissipate in an instant from him. "Rory, why are you back?" Michael asked, visibly terrified and angry, in a slow, methodical voice that seemed to slam Michael's senses.
"I never left you."
Rory glided across the room until he was just in front of Michael, as Michael tried to scurry away, but paralyzed to do so. This wasn't the Rory Michael remembered. Even in their worst days, Rory never appeared like this. This was frightening. All black, with yellow eyes glowing and burning into Michael's soul. Michael lost sense of anything that brought him joy in his life. Hate, despair, surrounded by it, consumed in it, fear. And in an instant, Michael remembered the first time he had seen Rory and how afraid he was.
"Your father isn't here to make it better now, boy."
Rory leaned down as a black, smoky mist poured from his mouth and into Michael's own mouth. Blackness, darkness. The absence of any thought enveloped Michael. Suddenly, he came to, standing on the edge of a cliff, a single rock jutting from the ground, barely big enough to stand on, hundreds of feet above the tree line below. Before him hovered Rory, dark and demonic, laughing. Michael lost his balance and fell, catching himself with one hand on a small outcropped rock, his fingertips barely hanging on, dangling above the hard ground below. Michael's senses became assaulted. The confusion of whatever was happening was taking control. Michael tried moving his legs to get a hold of the rocky surface, but every movement threatened his grip. His thoughts jumbled into panic, crying and screaming, begging to be taken home. His weak fingers slipped and Michael plummeted to the ground with a smash that Michael felt in every muscle, tendon, organ, and bone. He jolted awake in his living room, Rory hovering over him, laughing. "What are you doing to me? Why?" Rory just laughed and blended back into the shadows. Michael ran out of the house, feeling lost, not knowing what was going on. One thing he knew, this was no imaginary friend. It never had been. He could now feel with clarity that Rory had been feeding off him, putting him into situations that only Rory could get him out of. But this was his house, his life he had worked hard to build. Michael collapsed in the grass with his head between his knees and his hands over his head. Everything seemed darker. The air was heavy with a foul stench. Had it always been there? And had he just not noticed? He couldn't be certain. Michael reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and called Anya. This time it took several rings before she picked up. "Michael, it's late. What's wrong?" Anya, the sister he never wanted to have to take care of him again, and he was now pleading to stay with her. Within minutes, Anya pulled into the driveway to see Michael sitting in the grass crying. She hurried out of her car, tying her robe as she crossed the lawn. "Michael, what are you doing?" She grabbed under his arm and helped him to his feet. Stumbling alongside her, Anya helped Michael into her car. Once in, she asked again, "Michael, what's wrong? What's happening?" Michael just stared through his window. "I can't stay here." Concerned, Anya replied, "Don't you want to get some clothes or something?" Michael turned to her, his eyes blazed with fear. "Just get me out of here. We're going to sell the house." 2 months passed without incident, but Michael had changed. Always looking over his shoulder, keeping the lights on in any time he was alone in Anya's house, and he was now feeling like he had overstayed his welcome in her home. Never mind the fact that he had the feeling she was taking care of him again. He had sold his grandmother's house to a developer, It was for the better. At least he tried to convince himself of that. His logic was that the house needed to be torn down. For all he understood, Rory was in that house, and the bridge between the two worlds should be sealed. But oftentimes, people make rash decisions when in crisis. Without understanding, there's nothing that can be done. Somehow, Michael was able to maintain his employment, though. Although he was not seen as the model employee anymore. His mental health had taken a shift. He didn't tell anyone why, too afraid to talk about it, even though he believed his living hell was over. His colleagues didn't invite him out for drinks anymore, and more times than not, they would walk the long way around to avoid his desk and any eye contact in general. If there's one thing Rory succeeded in, it was isolating Michael from nearly everyone else, mentally and physically. Or had Michael done this to himself? Another month went by, and Michael was sitting alone on the couch of his new apartment. He was feeling better. He was once again able to take care of himself on his own and didn't feel like a burden to Anya. There was still some guilt for selling his grandmother's home. It was the home his father had grown up in, the home he grew up in. Everything had happened so fast that he didn't have a chance to sit and think about his actions, or reactions, rather. But now, he took a deep breath and sighed it out. His mind scattered with the memories, the regret eating away at his psyche. His body weak from the move, he slumped down in his recliner and began to doze off. His eyes fluttered under the weight of exhaustion. His once bright blue eyes had dulled to a foggy grayish color. His once sandy blonde hair now a dirty blonde. The stress was taking its toll, and he knew it. Michael fell asleep on his recliner, the black leather upholstery squeaking under his restlessness. His eyes shot open with clarity to see the black demon hovering above him once more. Black flowing cloth moving in a windless apartment, his yellow eyes piercing Michael's fragile mentality. The air became cold, and the smell of sulfur filled the room. Paralyzed by fear, a single tear drew from Michael's eyes onto his cheek.
Play with me, Michael,
the heavy voice commanded. Michael tried to close his eyes to make it all go away, but it was no use. His focus was being held. The spirit slowly lowered itself down just before Michael's face. The black mist emanated from the being into Michael's mouth. Then, darkness. Michael snapped awake to find himself submerged, his eyes burning from the salt of the water. His oxygen in his lungs began to feel like lead balloons pulling him deeper into the watery abyss. Michael struggled, fought, kicked, and pulled to get to the surface. Below him, the murky water seemed to go on for miles. Above him, a glint of light. So he kicked and pulled his way up and up and up. As his head ripped through the surface of the water, Michael inhaled with a deep gasp. The swells carried Michael as he looked around to see nothing around. Just water, as far as he could tell. Struggling to stay afloat, Michael looked up to see his once imaginary friend turned horrific black spirit floating above him, laughing. Helpless, lost, and all alone, Michael took water into his lungs purposefully and sunk beneath the ocean's swell. Feeling the crushing weight of the ocean pushing him farther and farther down, Michael realized this sick game had been born of the fears he had told Rory as a child. But he also remembered Rory's own fear, a single fear that he knew would end Rory: loneliness. As Michael felt his life about to leave his body, he jolted awake. Back in his recliner, drenched in salt water, his once constant companion cackling a mind-piercing sound. But he remembered loneliness, Rory's one fear. Michael sprang to his feet, fighting the paralytic trance Rory had bound him with. He ran into his kitchen and scribbled something on a piece of paper, leaving it on the counter, then rushed past the dark spirit into his room and grabbed his pistol. Michael had bought the pistol for protection, but now It was going to be the weapon that would end Rory and his own torment. Michael sat on his bed, put the muzzle between his teeth, and watched as the dark demon once known as Rory became a frenzy of black haze, screaming in pain. Then Michael pulled the trigger. The neighbors heard the gunshot at 2 a.m. and called 911. Michael had ended his suffering, and with it, Rory ended with him. Anya was devastated. Her brother was never a burden to her, not even in his worst moments. She would have cared for him for the rest of his life if he had let her. But now, her life became meaningless. I know there are many disturbing factors and elements in this story, and it isn't for the faint-hearted, and for that I apologize, I really do. But there's something to be taken away from the tragedy of Michael. Mental health has become something we can no longer ignore. There are many men out there who feel isolated and alone because we're not supposed to talk about our troubles and demons. How many times have you heard, "be a man," or told someone the same thing? The mindset needs to change, and now. If you're struggling with your own mental health or know anyone who may be in need of help, there are resources. And while this isn't strictly an issue only for men, men are the most affected. Nearly 80% of suicides are men. Men who felt alone, isolated, or didn't want to bother anyone with their troubles. So watch for the signs that someone in your life may need help. Isolation, silence, mood swings, and responding to questions with simple answers such as, "I'm fine." They're all signs that the person needs your help. Urge them to talk. Urge them to seek help. The last thing any of us want is to be put into Anya's shoes because we didn't want to pry or bother someone. And if you're comfortable doing it, there are trained professionals ready to listen to you or those affected. A simple text to 988 or a call to the National Institute of Mental Health at 1-866-615-6464 could save a life. Being a man doesn't mean strength comes in silence. Until the next time, stay strong, stay safe, and know you are not alone.